Hey, welcome to the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. We continue our journey to help you win your fantasy football drafts. About 60% of your victories can be, or 60% of your team's success will be at the draft. So, uh, this is damn serious if you're wanting to win. Uh, So I suggest you start with lesson one, but this is lesson 15. We're continuing age analysis and looking at some other aspects here of the metrics. So let's continue. Uh, I have, and this is all tied back to reference class forecasting. You should definitely look at that lecture. It's important for us to understand the landscape of fantasy football and positions and fantasy points. So this table uh, is looking at maximum fantasy points by a player within each position by year. I highlighted the top five just to get some trends. And I think the continuing message that quarterbacks have changed, that position has changed since 2011. Let's see if I can get my little marker here. Yeah, so 2011, you can see we start finding our fourth top right here, and the last 3 years have all been max tops. So there's been one player that has just been dominant across the 18-year spectrum here. I think that's very interesting. Running backs had the barbell that there were in the early times really a standout running backs that were doing well. And now we're in the era, this was a trough from 7 to 14, 15. And now we've had 2 5-year tops here. This is McCaffrey. Notice he was second best in tops over 18 years. So, uh, that was a special season. I don't know if everything falls into place for that kind of dramatic, uh, production again in 2021. But just be aware that I think with when the stars are aligned, he's as good as any of the top 3 or 4 to produce spectacular numbers. So, running backs looks like they're kind of coming back. Certainly, the quarterbacks are here. Tight ends have actually shown and pretty good. And at least this is the top one. And we had some really good production in '09 to 13. And then in recent years, Kelsey, I think, Kittle, Kelsey, some of those guys are right in here. Uh, Think about tight ends. If you look at the distribution, it's really tight, and uh, it's not like there's a whole bunch that are at the top. It's really a skewed distribution, uh, and certainly not normal by any means if you know what normal distribution is. If not, you should probably be familiar with that common statistical view of a population, and we don't have that in tight ends. Wide receivers haven't been at the top for 5 years. Some of these numbers are close. That was okay. That wasn't too bad. Certainly in the top 8 or 9, but it hasn't been overwhelming. Some of these numbers here. So just be aware that, and again, it may be the atmosphere, the rules, the way teams are using wide receivers. Maybe there's more wide receivers. So the top wide receiver doesn't get as much opportunities. But it is clear if you look at the top running back, they are outproducing the top wide receiver. So I think that's reflected in the drafts the last 2 or 3 years and understanding that you have a chance to find a player that's going to contribute much higher across the season as a running back than a wide receiver if you're good enough to spot it, right? This is, these are assuming you find that, but remember we have injuries, etc., can change. So nothing's in stone, but it's good to at least get an understanding of the landscape, and that's part of what this lesson's going to work on, kind of setting these landscapes here. So this is max fantasy output by position. Here's the actual trend lines. Is uh, polynomial trends. I use that versus linear. I think polynomial is a little bit more sophisticated, and I do I don't need the simple when I'm thinking about trends. Again, running backs and the quarterbacks are up in the top range, and then wide receivers, and then tight ends. But I do note that last year, for instance, the running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, it's been the closest I've seen. That was pretty close. Those, pretty close there. But for the most part, tight ends, and there's been a few years, so it's been interesting to see the gaps in the max by positions here. But we've had a lot of spread here in recent times, except for last year. There was a nice kind of closeness there. So you had a shot at grabbing a wide receiver that was as good as a running back. Wasn't quite as good, but better. So it all depends. I mean, look at McCaffrey here versus the top quarterback. Wow. You won your league if you had him 2019. Okay, so stare at that. Think about the gaps, the patterns here. What are we thinking? Will 2021 be more like this pattern, or will we see a breakout running back again and leaving the wide receivers and tight ends in the dust? Will tight ends be like this, close to the running backs? I mean, and the wide receivers, or further down like in these years? I mean, the last few years you would predict the best tight ends are not going to be, but Kelsey did really well. Look at him right there. Interesting. But none of the others could make. There's only been a few years of 18 that we've seen this closeness here. So it's a special tight end that can put you near. And so I think that's driving even early drafting in 2021. Just be aware that this could be the exception versus the rule. People think that this is what happened last year, so it happens again. And when I look at the gaps, I don't see any kind of statistical kind of uh, sameness. I see lots of variation, especially in tight end gaps. So to me, that's very interesting. Uh, just wanted to confirm yearly top by year in position. So we look through each year. What's the top position? If you take the top and make it, what is its proportion? Because each one of these years equals the top of 100. So we're seeing wide receiver, running backs, and quarterbacks doing the business, and tight ends and wide receivers are never at the top. I mean, notice 24, 25, and 21. There was that, it's another way to look at the distribution, how close. And, we've never had a tight end beat a wide receiver, but they've come close. And since there's not many of those, people say there's scarcity in the good ones, and they're worth as good as the top wide receivers, because you can probably get another good wide receiver to replace the one you'll miss in your draft if you go tight end. At least that's the idea, except when you have this kind of year or these kind of years. Yeah, your plans work out until it's a down year. So this is not written in blood, this kind of pattern, by any means. But wide receivers, for the most part, are not producing like running backs. Okay, so just be aware of that. And here's that last year gap there, uh, low gap level. And you can look across the years 2002 to 2020. But the dominants are the running backs and the quarterbacks. And the quarterbacks really, if you look across 18 years, pretty much own the show there. There are a few years. McCaffrey beat the quarterback, whoever this was. I think that was 07. And in the early years, the trend was that. So I think early fantasy players, were very dominated by the running backs, and that switched. So some older players may not have ever switched. You can't remember the glory days, okay? But there are some closeness here. And given the scarcity of good running backs, grabbing a quarterback way too early could be costly, in your playoffs there. And I think that's pretty common knowledge here. So now we're looking across the positions, not across the years. So quarterbacks, the top five have been, three of the top five have been the last 3 years. Very intriguing. Running backs, we kind of have the barbell, nice three in this range, and two of the top five are, 2019 and 2016. Tight ends, 95%. Here's 100%. So this era and this. So last two of the 3 years, it's been good news for drafting that tight end. Very good news. But we had a down year, so be aware. It's not, steady at all. Wide receivers, we haven't really had a good year in a while. I mean, 2019 wasn't so bad, but in fact, it almost hit the running backs here. So that was a fairly good year, but uh, I think there's a steadiness to it, but it's not just like crushing by any means. And I think the distribution of running backs versus wide receivers is different. And I think that positional scarcity concept is legitimate. Here we are with the quarterbacks, and then here is the wide receivers. So there, and then there's our friend, the tight end, right there. So uh, it was a good year for all three of those positions and kind of a down year for running backs there. So be aware that that can flip at any time. Looking at the data in this kind of a linear by position direction here. So study this. Here's the running backs, that barbell situation, high here, high there. Tight ends have been improving, the orange, and really did well last year. And then there's been, of course, the quarterbacks have been on a rise, certainly. And the wide receivers have also kind of been coming back recently. So I would consider a tight end or one of the top running backs. I mean, if you really think there's going to be an injury risk with some of the running backs, that's always been the concept of the zero RB, is if you draft later running backs, then they will take the place based on injury or other situations. So you want the chaos to take over, right? The anti-fragile nature of the drafting of the late round running back. And it's kind of hard to depend. I think those that succeed do it because they're there, and you might, if you play multiple leagues, you might try different, spread your risk a little bit in different draft strategies. I think that's reasonable. Here's just looking at year sectors and looking at the metrics here just to kind of see where we're at. And the one below is the kind of the overall 18-year averages here. So just for taking a look at the averages, and we can see the sector averages here and just kind of get a feel for the landscape, what's going on. Notice that, for instance, wide receivers there's more good wide receivers than running backs. That's why you see the difference in these numbers. Okay, see that? And only have the last 4 years have we seen kind of either an uptake on running backs, probably. I don't think, I'm sorry, wide receivers have changed much in their distribution. So if you can land at the top running back, you probably have done well in the draft. Here's a box and whisker plot looking at these average numbers by position, just to show you that quarterbacks are the show these days and the distribution. Notice the variation. The bigger the box, the length, the more the players are stretched out. Notice how tight the tight ends are. So if you got a tight end that sits above the crowd, then that's really something. And then the running backs and wide receivers are have a little more population uh, distribution, but they're still fairly tight. Quarterbacks have less uh, tightness and a little bit longer tails on the distribution. Here's the fantasy point averages for the sectors, just kind of focusing back in for us. We've seen this before, but I wanted to visualize this a little bit here from the different year sectors and positions, and kind of show that, just kind of confirm what we see. Uh, in some ways, there's not a lot of changes in quarterbacks and wide receivers and tight ends. There's been some increase, but I think just taking a look at that here, variation. The quarterbacks have a lot of variation to them, probably the highest. So some people would say the uncertainty of drafting, especially late round quarterbacks, is an issue. And I think streaming quarterbacks is a result of dealing with that variation. In other words, people don't draft two quarterbacks and that's all they use. I think you've got to have flexibility to go out and grab the quarterback that's favored, to pop up based on game, metrics and defenses and weather situations here. Tight ends are very tight. They're a lot linked together, and I think the idea that touchdowns make or break a tight end's week is fairly obvious, and that's since there's a lot of unpredictability. I think that leads to most tight ends across the years being nearly the same in distribution. A lot more variation in running backs than wide receivers. So I think the concept that wide receivers, there's a nice block of wide receivers that are producing about the same is true, and that feeds the zero running back idea. And look at the variation that's come about in the last few years. I think that's driven the zero running back concept, having that variation, having the injury history and things. And I think that's true. Notice in the old days, lots of variation in the running back in 2002 and 6. So there's been years where running backs were really had a lot of variation, and that's that adds to the more variation, the more uncertainty about outcomes. So in some ways, if you grab a late tight end, you probably are getting as good as is a whole bunch in an area. It's just the skewed few at the top make the scarcity really really different. I think that's drives the early tight end drafting as well, and that can make sense. If you got somebody above the ranks here, and the ranks are so tight that you will enjoy a nice advantage there, and that drafting an early tight end is not something that I would shy away from at all. If Kelsey, Waller, or Kittle, somebody dropped in my lap, then I would tend to consider taking them. I sure would. So just right now, and I was successful last year, I tended to go tight end or running back unless I felt that the running backs to me were not players that I wanted. Then I would draft a wide receiver, and I waited on the quarterbacks. Maybe shouldn't have, but I did. I'm thinking that that's the data is supporting kind of that journey, so that is something to consider. And here's the variation distribution showing that the quarterbacks have high distribution, high variation, running backs fairly high. Wide receivers, there's a little bit of, variation. Of course, tight ends are very low, very low. So in some ways, I don't know if I don't get one of those standout tight ends. I'm not sure I'm not streaming tight ends. I think I will. I think I did last year. If I didn't have a solid tight end, I think I just streamed. Okay, so I stream quarterbacks, stream tight ends. I think that's reasonable. So that's my lesson here for this, lesson 15. Thank you for listening to the process. Hopefully, I'm spreading the wealth and going to help you. Notice the word help. Doesn't mean guarantee. Doesn't mean you're not going to put in effort. You should. And if you need instant gratification, there's no secrets here in these lessons and data. It's a slog, and expecting, just, you know, nuggets that rain down and, make you win every league you play. It's just, those things don't exist. I understand, pundits out there would love for you to think that they are the ones that will sprinkle those nuggets to you. Uh, not not convinced here. Uh, that's really something that happens out there. But anyway, come back. We're going to continue uh, our lessons and try to uh, help you with the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. Thanks for listening. Come back soon.